It was that rare event in Washington, an actual resignation based on principle. 31 years ago this month, William Weld was Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department's Criminal Division. But then, in a move that shocked the Capitol, Weld, along with 5 Justice Department colleagues, including the Deputy Attorney General, quit in protest. The then Attorney General, Edwin Meese, was embroiled in controversy, under investigation by a special prosecutor over allegations of corruption. Weld and his colleagues were convinced the swirl of allegations around Meese were tarnishing the reputation of the department. These are truly resignations of conscience. They simply couldn't work for Ed Meese any longer, one department official told the New York Times. Weld's resignation was only one of a series of pivotal events in a lengthy career that has included serving on the staff of the House Impeachment Committee that investigated Richard Nixon, serving as U.S. Attorney in Boston, where he prosecuted mobsters and big financial institutions, and being elected twice in the 1990s as governor of Massachusetts. He got some brief attention 3 years ago when he bolted the Republican Party to run for vice president on the Libertarian Party ticket. But now he could get a lot more attention. He's recently announced he set up an exploratory committee to test the waters for a primary challenge to Donald Trump, who he recently said is, quote, simply too unstable to carry out the duties of the highest executive office. How serious is Weld? Does he have a chance? And how, as a one-time top prosecutor, does he assess the president's legal troubles? We'll talk to him about that and lots more on this episode of Skullduggery.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
There will be no lies. We will honor the American people with the truth and nothing else.
I'm Michael Isikoff, Chief Investigative Correspondent for Yahoo News.
And I'm Dan Klaidman, Editor-in-Chief of Yahoo News.
You know, it is so interesting to look back at that moment at the end of the Reagan administration when people at the Justice Department actually quit on an issue of conscience and principle.
Yeah, I started covering justice just a few years after that, and I remember that event kind of hung over the department. It was this kind of dramatic thing, and what it said was that, you know, if you politicized the Justice Department or if you acted as Attorney General in a way that, you know, without integrity, there were consequences for that. You know, people would actually take action. And you sort of wonder, like, man, have times changed?
Yeah.
You know, because there was always this question in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, all the crazy things that were happening at Justice and this president attacking the Justice Department and Sessions and meanwhile, Rod Rosenstein.
Right.
You know,
right. You know,
he didn't quit.
No,
right?
he didn't.
He would have had reasons to quit in an act of conscience.
He got used by the president to fire Comey. He had serious questions about the president's stability based on all the reports we've gotten, in actually even raising the issue of the 25th Amendment. And yet. And he watched the president attack the special counsel, Robert Mueller, who Rosenstein, selected and was overseeing. And yet Rod just, continued into, I guess he's stepping down in the next few days. But, it would be interesting to hear his
with a whimper, not with a bang.
Yeah, but hear his perspective on what Bill Weld did 30 years ago.
And that's why I'm really excited to interview Weld on this episode of the show. He is such an interesting character. And look, I mean, right now, does he have any chance? Do we think he has any chance of defeating Donald Trump in his primary challenge? Probably not. Certainly a real kind of long shot.
Right.
But he's going to be a really interesting candidate out there. And it's funny, I was thinking that, maybe by, within a few weeks, Trump won't have Robert Mueller to contend with because his report will be out and Mueller will shut down. But he may have Bill Weld out there, a former head of the criminal division, U.S. attorney, mob busting, corruption busting,
a guy who
gunslinging
knows
prosecutor.
how to make to make criminal cases, RICO cases, to put pieces of evidence together to build the grounds for making a crime for. Charging somebody with a crime. So it'll be really interesting to hear how he assesses Trump's legal vulnerability.
And the other thing I'd say about Weld is I've always thought that whoever challenges Donald Trump to be successful either on the Democratic side or in a primary challenge, you've got to be in some ways a kind of a larger-than-life character to deal with Donald Trump's oversized personality. And I think that is Bill Weld. I mean, a lot of people may remember this really amazing moment when he was governor and he was touting his, governor of Massachusetts, he was touting his environmental record, having cleaned up the Charles River, and he was giving a press conference right there on the Charles River. And at the end of it, what did he do in his Brooks Brothers suit? He just turned around and he dove into the river.
Yeah. Well, actually, my favorite anecdote from those days is, Weld is a true Brahmin. One of his ancestors was among the earliest students, class of 1650 at Harvard, and then 18 more Welds went to Harvard. 2 buildings are named for the family. When the then Massachusetts Senate President Billy Bolger teased him about his all-American heritage and wealth, pointing out that his ancestors had come over on the Mayflower, Weld corrected him. Actually, they weren't on the Mayflower. They sent the servants over first to get the cottage ready, which I thought was a pretty good line. Anyway, and on that note, why don't we bring in Bill Weld?
Excellent.
Okay, we are now joined by Governor Bill Weld, who recently launched his exploratory bid for president. And Governor, welcome to Skullduggery.
Great to be here.
So when you announced, you called the president a schoolyard bully, and you said Washington Republicans were exhibiting all the symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome. How do you break somebody of Stockholm Syndrome?
Stockholm syndrome, just for the record, is when you are captured by somebody or some group and you identify with your captor. You kind of give up.
Right.
And you throw in with them. And, I get a little bit that sense of Washington these days, that's what has happened in some of the halls of Congress.
And to what do you attribute that?
I don't know. I find it hard to follow. I mean, I have long said that the two-party system in Washington has gotten inefficient, to put it mildly, because all they really care about is getting reelected, and that means demonizing the other party so you can motivate your base to give you a lot of money so you will have the funds to pay for ads so you can get reelected. It's kind of a vicious circle.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, I guess, Governor, you're talking about Republicans in Washington, elected officials, but I mean, all the latest polls show that 90% of Republicans around the country support Donald Trump. Are they experiencing Stockholm Syndrome also?
What I say to that is that 6 months is forever in politics, as we all know, which means 2 years is 4 times forever. And don't tell me nothing's going to change between now and Election Day of 2020. Matter of fact, it could come sooner rather than later.
And plus, they haven't had a choice, right? Because there's no one, and now they might, because you may.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I spoke up and raised my hand is we know a lot more about Donald J. Trump and what his style of governing and his substance of his decisions in government than we did 2 years ago. I wouldn't have raised my hand and say we have to throw this guy out the day after he was elected. He won the election, after all. But now we got a track record, and I think it leaves a great deal to be desired, both domestically and internationally.
Well, what disturbs you the most about the president's conduct?
I think his meanness. I mean, he says he's a counterpuncher. Baloney. That's vindictiveness, and it's often directed at little people. Mm-hmm. Instincts, very bad. And, it's no secret that his stock and trade is divisiveness and trying to stir up the pot and pitch groups against each other. And as long as everyone's teeth are an edge, he's happy. He thinks that's good for his politics. And that's Steve Bannon and Breitbart politics. And it's something new in the United States. And it's nasty.
But you've said something else about it. Let me read this quote. Our president is simply too unstable to carry out the duties of the highest executive office in the land. The Constitution and the 25th Amendment contemplates a scenario in which if the president is unstable and can't carry out his or her official duties, they can be removed. Would you support the cabinet and vice president invoking the 25th Amendment?
No, I don't think we're quite there, but apparently there were some such conversations very early in the administration, which got the president's full attention when he learned of it.
At
what do you
the
mean?
Justice Department,
Right.
to wit, yes.
But
Right.
maybe there are some people out there who think you wouldn't have to elaborate on this, but what do you mean by unstable?
Well, I remember saying this in 2016. I said the president's too unstable to be to lead the United States. If one of our children, age 10, acted that way at the dinner table, we would require him to leave the dinner table, and that's a 10-year-old child. So it's just corking off in all directions constantly, taking everything personally, making himself the center of everything that has to be considered. They call it narcissism. There's a form of narcissism called malignant narcissism, where an additional wrinkle is you're not happy unless other people are losing. And that has characterized the president's business career. Every time he went bankrupt in Atlantic City, first of all, he would tell the banks, unless you give me a lot more money than I had before I declare bankruptcy, I'm walking and you'll lose everything. You'll lose all your collateral. So the banks went along and gave him a lot of money. But my current point is he made certain that the little people didn't get paid, the vendors who'd worked for him there. Maybe 5, 10 cents on the dollar, maybe for great big ones who sued him, maybe 30 cents on the dollar. But nobody got paid except him.
So we're not quite at 25th Amendment territory, in your view. What about impeachment?
Well, I think I've said often that the president is way beyond anything Richard Nixon ever did in terms of fomenting disrespect for the rule of law, trying to keep the Justice Department from doing its constitutional duty of, doing justice without fear or favor. That's kind of the motto of the Justice Department. On the walls of the Justice Department building in Washington at 10th and Constitution, it says a government of laws and not of men. That obviously means nothing to the current president of the United States, and that's a sad state of affairs, beyond sad, actually.
All right. Well, you can speak with some authority on this because you were on the staff of the House Judiciary Committee during Richard Nixon's impeachment.
In fact, you were hired to research the legal grounds for impeachment, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I worked on that memo for like 5 months.
So are you saying that the president's conduct that's already been made public, that we know about right now, is grounds to impeach him?
Well, impeachment would lie, put it that way. But it's a political remedy, and I understand that Speaker Pelosi doesn't want to go there if she feels that there are never going to be the votes in the Senate to convict. So, she's fast-forwarding to the 2020 election, and I've come around to that view.
You think that's the right judgment?
I do. I knew so much about the grounds for impeachment that months ago I was thinking, oh boy, that's what's coming. But I now think, because of the essentially political nature of the impeachment process, that discretion may be the better part of valor.
Are you saying that even if the Democrats had the votes in the Senate, that because the process would be perceived as being so political, that impeachment shouldn't be an option?
If the Democrats had the votes in the Senate, this thing would go through like suet through a goose. Are you kidding me?
Right. And under that scenario, would you be in favor of pursuing impeachment? I know you're not a Democrat.
Well,
but
it's not my job, as they say. I don't think all the facts are out there, but I do think that the facts that are public put this president well beyond what President Nixon did. And, you know, if memory serves, there were 3 articles of impeachment that were voted through
beyond
by
what
the House.
Richard Nixon did.
That's my view.
Give me the particulars.
In terms of the rule of law.
Yeah, give me the particulars.
Well, where to start? You know, expressing disrespect for the rule of law, telling the head of the FBI that his job was to be loyal to the president, that everyone had to be a respecter of persons, and in particular one person, and that's how the world works. Well, that's not how the world works when the constitutional scheme is being carried out, and that's the ultimate grounds for impeachment or removal of an officer is interference with the constitutional scheme. And this president has done almost nothing except that, hollowing out the State Department, hollowing out the Justice Department, and telling the Justice Department that its job, essentially, is to be loyal to him and protect his political skirts.
So
that's not their job.
If you had your old job of being on the staff of the Judiciary Committee and you were drafting articles, how would they read? How many articles would there be? And
well, I was about to say that the article that got the most votes in the Nixon impeachment in the House Judiciary Committee was Article 2, called Agency Abuse, and it was misuse of the FBI and the CIA by trying to direct them not to pursue the Watergate inquiry on the ground that it involved national security.
Right.
That was the offense. Now, we've seen more than that from this president. It doesn't have the additional characteristic of being in technicolor and lurid detail in terms of the tapes that Mr. Nixon kept. But essentially...
Which was helpful to making the case. In fact, you know, that's what pushed it over. It was the tapes.
I'm not sure if those tapes hadn't existed, that things would have panned out the way they did. But, you know, since the tapes were there, it was possible to conclude that Mr. Nixon had been lying to the American people on television for months and months and months, saying, I am not a crook, when he had directed Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman to go do this and try and get the investigation quashed on the ground that it was trenching on national security. That was nothing but a lie. And, you know, I think we've seen, I do think it's fair to say that the president is a loose man with the truth, this president.
You think?
And we've seen a lot of stuff, a daily basis, come out of the president's mouth that is not true. And one of the things that galls me is the president is the worst possible role model for our children and grandchildren. They're gonna grow up thinking this is how the occupant of the highest office in the land acts. That's got to be terrible for kids.
Mm-hmm. You were a U.S. attorney. You were in the Justice Department. You were head of the criminal division of the Justice Department.
Right.
And you resigned as a matter of conscience, so it was reported at the time, because the then Attorney General, Ed Meese, was under investigation at the time. Talk to us about that, and do you see any, is that a role model for people who are in the Justice Department today, your resignation?
Well, you know, there was... the same issue was at play, namely politicization of the Justice Department. And I spent 5 years as a U.S. attorney and 2 years as head of the criminal division in Maine Justice, trying to keep the politics out of law enforcement. And I'd made a big change in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. When I came in, I didn't ask anybody whether they were a Republican or a Democrat. And, you know, that was a change. The office had been, with some exceptions, largely a patronage office before then, political spoils. And both parties, Republicans as well as Democrats, although there were a lot more Democrats in power in that state. So that was, you know, an article of faith for me, and I let nothing interfere with that. And when I get to Washington and I see the department being politicized, and it was, our morning meeting around the AG's table was as much about politics as it was about law enforcement.
How so?
There was just a lot of discussion. There were a lot of movement conservatives around that table, and there were some naive, libertarian-oriented people like me. But I was not alone. There was maybe 30% were libertarians and small government people. And we would joke about that and then go out and get the boss's work done. And when I say the boss, I mean Ronald Reagan.
Well, let me ask you, because at the Justice Department, there's the investigative and prosecutorial mission, but there's also a policy mission as well. So when you're talking about policy, there is a place for politics in discussions of policy. Are you saying that at the time politics actually infected the law enforcement mission, the investigations and prosecutions as well?
Well, it was more the tone that was set from the top. And let me say, by the way, Ed Meese personally is one of the greatest guys I've ever met. If little things mean a lot, Ed Meese is a saint, and that is important. But I think, what befell Ed was he had been counselor of the president in the West Wing before he came over to be AG, and I think he had a hard time ever taking off his White House hat. And his White House hat meant his loyalty to Ronald Reagan, but that's not supposed to be top of mind if you're Attorney General of the United States. Some other job, perhaps. I suggested 3 years ago that perhaps Mr. Trump could get some other job, the laundry business maybe, any job, but not President of the United States.
In fact, before we went on the show, you told us a little vignette about loyalty, because I think you were called up to Congress to testify about your resignation. So tell that story.
Yeah, no, Deputy Attorney General Arnie Burns and I and 4 other people resigned, and we were asked to come up and testify before Senate Judiciary about why we resigned. And Arnie said his piece that, the department was like Alice in Wonderland, up was down and south was north, because it was just immobilized by the Attorney General's difficulties, and Ed had been on the receiving end of a couple of special prosecutor investigations. And I said, well, I thought beyond that there were legal issues that were troubling, and I didn't want to send a message by continuing in that office that everything was just fine, because I didn't think it was fine. And one of the senators asked me, Mr. Weld, how could you possibly have done this thing? Ed Meese brought you to Washington. And, if nothing else, I would think the demands, the strictures of loyalty would prevent you from even considering such a move. And I said what I always say, Senator, I think that too often, particularly in this town, referring to Washington, D.C., loyalty is simply an excuse for doing the wrong thing. Well, you could have heard a pin drop in the hearing room, and it was a cavernous room. No one in Washington wanted to hear that.
Interesting, given that it was, as you pointed out, President Trump's request of Comey that he give him loyalty, that was your sort of exhibit A.
It sounded more like an order than a request to me.
Yeah, right.
By the way, one of your colleagues, as U.S. Attorney, when you were serving in Massachusetts, he was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, was Rudy Giuliani.
Oh, Rudy taught me a lot. He and I did all the mob cases together.
So Giuliani has been one of the president's most aggressive
he's his lawyer.
Defenders, his lawyer.
As you would
a lot of it
expect
is
him to
on.
be.
Yeah, he's his lawyer.
Right.
He's on cable TV. He's gotten a lot of criticism for how he's handled this particular representation. What do you think of how Rudy Giuliani has done, going from being the mob-busting U.S. attorney back in the days when you guys were working together, and how he's handled himself with Donald Trump today?
I have such a long and close relationship with Rudy. It's hard for me to be objective. I campaigned for him as mayor. He campaigned for me as governor. But beyond that, in the Justice Department, and when we were fellow U.S. attorneys, we were the Bobbsey twins. I had 109 convictions and 111 public corruption prosecutions. Rudy and I actually worked together developing the PC, the probable cause, for the wiretap that would lead to making the commission case, the existence of the commission with the heads of the 5 organized crime families getting together. Until then, it had always been the received idea in Washington that the existence of the commission was a myth.
Yeah.
J. Edgar Hoover always said it was a myth. Well, it wasn't a myth at all.
Yeah,
they would get together with Meyer Lansky in Miami and decide what was going to be done.
Yeah.
And, Rudy and I both read Joe Bonanno's autobiography called A Man of Honor, and there were some things in there that set us to thinking. And he all but adverts to the existence of the commission, and one thing led to another, and a little bit of wiretap evidence leads to something else, and next thing you know, Rudy brought the commission case and brought the whole house crumbling down.
I just have to say as an aside, because it's one of my favorite books, I actually read that book, but also Gay Talese's book about Joe Bonanno, I think it was called Honor Thy Father, is a brilliant book. He lived with Joe Bananas, as they called him, for like a year. It was The Sopranos before The Sopranos existed.
So, so you and Rudy were the Bobbsey twins. You were tight. I mean, do you guys still talk?
Yeah, I've kept up with Rudy. I went to his wedding to Judith.
So
if you become president, you're going to appoint him attorney general?
Well, two people that I've had long and close relationships with are Rudy Giuliani and Newt Gingrich. We did a lot of business together. When Newt got in 95, he had 3 Republican governors, myself and John Engler of Michigan, Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, come down to talk to his troops and say, look, we took tough stands in our first term. We cut taxes and we cut spending, and we did real small government conservative stuff. And in our states, which were basically blue states, we were hung in effigy for 2.5 years, and then we were reelected with over 70% of the vote. So you too can take tough votes, and Newt wanted his members to hear that.
All right. So have you talked to Rudy since you announced your exploratory campaign?
No. When we've been thrown together, and we used to see each other out in East Hampton, Long Island, at socially.
Right.
In recent years, other than that, it hasn't been a professional.
Look, his position on Trump, is that the president has every right to hire and fire whoever he wants in the executive branch, including in law enforcement, the Justice Department, and the FBI, and so therefore, accusing him of abuse of power for firing the FBI director for whatever purpose he wanted is fine.
Well, I think that's too absolutist a position. I think if you can prove motivation, you're entitled to.
By the way, sorry, if you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, okay, and the motivation here would be to shut down the Russia investigation.
I'm not saying that's the case, but motivation can be proved by extrinsic evidence.
Right.
A lot of lay people think, oh, you can't prove anything against me unless you got it in writing. That's not true. Circumstantial evidence is often more damning than direct evidence.
So in your years as U.S. Attorney and as head of the criminal division, did the name Donald Trump ever come across your radar?
No. I knew him in the decade of the aughts when my wife and I lived in New York, a little bit.
Oh, really? How so? What was
socially, cocktail parties.
Oh, yeah?
I know that's how I know he and I are not the same height, for example.
Well, actually, he claimed, according to his latest, the White House latest medical report, that he's 6'3". How tall are you?
6'3", and we're not the same height.
You're taller.
That's correct.
Okay.
So one question that we ask all the smart lawyers and former Justice Department officials who come on our show is a legal question. Can a sitting president be indicted? And I guess it can be a legal question. It can be a policy question. What is your view of that?
If you look in Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, it says that the punishment on conviction, impeachment and conviction is nothing more than removal from office and inability to hold any office of trust and honor under the laws of the United States, thereafter forever, a lifetime ban. And it goes on to say, but the president shall remain, or whoever, any civil officer of the United States, including the president, shall remain liable to indictment, conviction, and punishment in the ordinary course. Now, I draw a couple of conclusions from that. One, obviously that means after he leaves office, he can be indicted, convicted, and punished. Two, it must mean that the president could be subject to some form of charge, an indictment, a sealed indictment, or an indictment that then stayed by order of the court while he is president. What I think is not good policy is the idea that the president can be hauled into criminal court to answer for a garden variety criminal case while he's president, because we have to run a world out there. And if you take the president off the field of battle onto the sidelines of a criminal court while he's in office, you can't run a world that way.
Well, don't you take him off the field of battle if you initiate impeachment proceedings?
You do. No, not if you initiate them. Only if you convict him with a 2/3 vote of the
no,
members.
But you're
I'm
present
saying
in the
going
Senate.
through an impeachment
is
trial
a
let's say,
distraction.
you think that's less of a distraction than the criminal process?
I do. The criminal process in the Article 3 judicial court is really a full-time operation.
Yeah.
Take my word for it.
Yeah. Of the various crimes Donald Trump has been accused of, the one that seems the most serious because it's been sort of endorsed by the Southern District in Manhattan are the campaign finance violations, the payments of hush money. And we have sort of new details on that, showing those checks that were personally written by the president while in office to Michael Cohen, reimbursing him for the hush money to Stormy Daniels. Is that, in your view, a prosecutable crime, and is it an impeachable crime?
Well, I don't think of the most serious offenses as being campaign finance. I think of them as being obstruction of justice and undermining the rule of law. Right. And, technically, if there are false statements made in connection with a mailing of any kind or even a telephone call, that's mail fraud and wire fraud. Those are predicate offenses for the racketeering animal that came in and was used so often by Rudy Giuliani and myself. And there are many theories you could pursue. I'm somewhat taken by what I call Danglegate, which is the dangling of pardons in front of people who used to work for you and seem to have turned against you, and now you want them to either shut up or go pretend to work with the prosecutors and get information that way. In theory, if a president were to dangle a pardon, which is an official act, in front of someone in order to induce them to go pretend to cooperate with the prosecution, but then report back to the president, why then the president would be receiving a thing of value in return for an official act. That's not obstruction of justice, but it is bribery. Under 18 U.S.C. 212.
Well, that depends on the nature of the dangle, right? I mean, how was it communicated and by whom?
That's right. And I dare say if this stuff all moves forward, we're going to hear a lot of "I was just kidding" from the president. But, I think the 2016 campaign waged by the president was a series of dog whistles to people whom he hoped would be supporting him, and the fact that only dogs can hear it doesn't mean you didn't whistle it.
All right, let's talk politics for now. Yeah, we got to. You've announced this exploratory bid. How's it going? You getting any traction? Are you getting any money?
Everybody says, good on you. This is great. Somebody's got to do it. It's a disgrace to the country that other people haven't, or that no one's pointing out the emperor doesn't have new clothes on.
But are you doing it to win and become president, or are you doing it to hurt Donald Trump's chances of getting reelected?
I think the only reason to do something like this is to do it with the purpose in mind of winning. And, those who know me well would tell you that I've thought for well over a decade now that I could start Monday as President of the United States just by virtue of the experience that I've had, both two-term governor and having worked in both the House and the Senate and been head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. And I'm no spring chicken. I'm 10 months older than the president. But there's an upside to that in a way. You do get wiser as you get older, and I've seen a lot.
There are a number of septuagenarians in the race at the moment, right?
There are.
One just announced and seems to be getting a lot of traction. But look, Politico just had a piece saying, you had your exploratory bid last month. Then they write, you went dark. Aside from a few television hits and public appearances, the former Massachusetts governor has done little to suggest his primary election challenge to Trump is something the president needs to worry about.
Well, first of all, I'm going to make this decision on my timetable, not somebody else's timetable. Okay. I have been in New Hampshire every week since my February 15th speech in Bedford, New Hampshire, and doing town halls and getting a good reaction there. But beyond that, the stuff I've been doing outside New Hampshire has received unanimous encouragement.
Let me ask you this, Governor. The last time you ran, that was 2016, you ran as a libertarian.
Right.
This time, you're running as a Republican, but you seem to be fundamentally out of step with the current Republican Party and electorate. I mean, you're pro-choice, you're pro-LGBT, you believe in climate change. I think you're pretty liberal on immigration. Correct me if I'm wrong. Why do you think that with those policies that you're going to be able to bring the Republican Party along with you?
I think those are the right policies, and I would say I'm totally the same person I was when I ran as a libertarian 3 years ago.
You haven't changed.
Well,
the Republican Party has changed.
That's my point.
Yeah.
And when the Whig Party broke into two in the 1850s on the issue of slavery, the southern half became the know-nothing party because they would say, "I know nothing," when asked about their secret meetings. And they were characterized by violent anti-immigrant fervor. They hated Catholics. They hated the immigrants coming in from Germany and Italy, and also violent rallies and also devotion to conspiracy theories. Well, that sounds awfully familiar to me. That's the Trump campaign of 2016. Now, the other wing of the party, the anti-slavery northern wing, went over and got together with John C. Fremont's Free Soil Party and elected Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States 4 years later. So I'm rejoining not the party, the Know-Nothing Party. I'm rejoining what I hope will be the party of Lincoln, and that's the whole point.
Okay, so where is that going at this point? Do you have endorsements? Are you getting any? How much money have you raised?
Well, you can't raise money when you're in the.
Well, you're for your exploratory committee. You can.
I don't think you can ask people to raise money for a super PAC or a campaign. I haven't needed to raise money for the exploratory committee.
Are you self-financing
I
the
did.
campaign? Yes. Right. How much money are you putting in?
Tell you later.
All right. Well, presumably you're
Does your wife
for
know?
transparency, but anyway. But endorsements. I mean, you are running as a Republican.
I could be asking all my old friends and former governors and former senators and even some current ones, endorse me, endorse me, endorse me. I need to get momentum. No, I'm not going to do that. Well, I don't want
to do.
Well, I don't ask people to do something that may not be in their immediate interest. I'd rather go out and prove that I've got something going and that the message that we need to have someone standing as a Republican who's not acting the way the current occupant of the White House is. I think that's a powerful message. Nobody would say to Tom Paine, "Well, we're not going to pay attention to you unless you issue 160 more broadsides." It was, where he stood in the political scheme of things, and I think that's important.
But you need a finely honed message, and I guess I'm not really hearing what that is, other than the president's a schoolyard bully and too unstable. But I mean, can you? Is there a 3-point Weld program at this point, or a message you have for voters?
Sure.
What is it?
Cut spending, worry about the debt. We're putting all that $22 trillion of debt on our children and grandchildren.
Were you against the tax cut?
No, I was for the tax cut. I'm a
Isn't
supply
that
side.
what's fueled the deficit,
No,
the tax cut?
No. It's been to get to $22 trillion and to have $1 trillion every year, and the president only now considering his first veto means he didn't veto 1 cent of that $1 trillion. And I did cut spending in real dollars year over year when I was governor, and I was voted most fiscally conservative governor in the United States, and that was as the new governor of Massachusetts by the Wall Street Journal and Cato Institute. We also cut taxes 21 times. I'm not sure I've ever met a tax cut I didn't like. So cutting taxes and cutting spending. And now there's some huge issues like climate change, which the president says is a hoax, so he won't have to do anything about it. We're going to have the polar ice cap melt if we don't do anything about that. And everyone's coastline is going to be rearranged, so there's going to be a lot of shorefront property that's not shorefront property.
What do you want to do about climate change?
We rejoin the Paris Accords and have the United States adopt 2050 targets that are consonant with those of other countries.
What do you think of the Green New Deal?
That as currently sketched, it looks too expensive. But I've been an environmentalist my whole life, and I don't care who knows it. So I would be in that one up to my elbows. I also think internationally, the president's shown very bad judgment. And this is by way of telling you what I would do, not just that he's a bad guy. But I thought that not joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a terrible blunder. And the president's stated reason for being against it in the 2016 campaign, when he first came out against it, was that it would be dominated by China. He hadn't taken the trouble to find out that China was not a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that the whole argument for it was to establish a powerful beachhead in Asia with Asian countries without China being at the table.
What about Russia? Well, just to get back to the one of the major themes of this podcast, what do you make of Trump's cozying up to Putin? The what was it, Helsinki?
Helsinki, where he
press
accepted
conference where
Putin's word that
over
they
his
didn't
own
interfere in
intelligence-
the election over the findings of the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement community.
What do you make of all that? What do you think? Why do you think he does this?
What Andrew McCabe said is probably true. He may or may not be a Russian asset, but he might as well be. And his devotion to Putin is part of a pattern of praising and emulating dictators and autocrats around the world. It's not just Mr. Putin, who may or may not have a hold over our president, but it's President Kim of South Korea. And the president early on said, what a strong kid, what a tough kid. Imagine, he offed his own uncle, and he even iced his brother. That's a strong kid. And he expressed great admiration for President Duterte of the Philippines, who actually holds the gun while he shoots people suspected of narcotics.
So you don't find these good role models for
no, I don't.
American
I don't.
president?
And I think Viktor Orban in Hungary is trying to move them out of the Western Bloc towards the Soviet bloc, just as Paul Manafort maneuvered to have the president of Ukraine do.
So he admires. He seems to admire dictators. But have you seen
and our enemies? And our enemies.
Yeah.
And when he met with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, and Ambassador Kislyak in the Oval Office, he kicked out all the American press and had the meeting monitored only by TASS, which is the Russian state press organ. What's that about?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
At some level, do you think? I mean, he's traitorous. I mean, he's a traitor.
No, that's a pretty strong word. you need two witnesses to an overt act to prove that.
It is a legal term.
But he does seem to have been going against the direct interests of the United States, saying NATO is a complete mess. We don't like NATO. Well, NATO is our alliance. It's not the Russia's alliance. Russia would like nothing better than to see NATO sink into the sea. And that's the direction that Mr. Trump, at least initially, took with respect to NATO.
Right. Well, of course, what he would say is that
I was just kidding and I backed off a little bit.
Well, I think he was saying that the European NATO members need to be paying more of their fair share for our common defense,
that's okay. But I believe he went on to say NATO's a joke. This is not a good purpose. We should be going in the other direction.
Right. All right, let's get back to politics for a moment, because you are running as a Republican, even though you were a libertarian 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago when you ran. Some people have speculated you're a stalking horse for Mitt Romney or Larry Hogan or somebody else getting in the race.
No, I'm not a stalking horse, and I don't care what anybody says about me. Once you've been head of the criminal division, the Justice Department, you really don't care what anyone says about you.
Right.
Would you like to see, say, John Kasich or Larry Hogan or Mitt Romney? Would you like to see them get into the race and also challenge Trump?
I wouldn't mind. It's no secret that I'm quite close with Governor Kasich, and a
lot of people thought he was going to get in, and he seems to have taken another route to be a CNN contributor.
Yeah, well, I don't know. But I do think he knows a lot about the budget. He knows a lot about armed services and military matters. So I don't think it would hurt the country. I'm far from saying I'm bestriding the earth like a colossus, and I have this ground, and no one else come near. No. I got things that I want to do in office, and they are the opposite of things that the current incumbent of the presidency is doing and has done, and I have a different way of approaching things, and that's enough for me.
What are some of the first things that you would do in office? Sometimes presidents want to take actions that are symbolic to send a message.
I agree with that, and I'd go one step further. I think you should have a short priority list for an office like this, and if you don't get done at least a majority of the things you want to do in your first 6 months in office, then you've been a failure because you've squandered the immense amount of political capital that you have by definition from having won that particular office. I would rejoin the Paris Accords very quickly. I would apply to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership very quickly. I would, let it be known that my foreign policy consisted of more than tariffs and sanctions, which are what President Trump says, I'm a tariff guy first and always. Well, I'm not a tariff guy first and always. And you can prove that free trade has always been good for the United States because we have the most, the greatest productivity per worker of any country in the world, including China, by a mile. There's no one even close to us. So we're always going to get the high-wage jobs as a result of unfettered free trade.
But look, everything you're saying about President Trump has been well known to Republican voters since they elected him and his entire time in office. So I come back to my first question, referencing your Stockholm Syndrome comment. How do you persuade your fellow Republicans to bolt from this president when your entire critique is something they know all too well?
Well, you got to meet the voters one at a time, I suppose, at the end of the day. You certainly have to meet them one at a time in New Hampshire. There are 20 states where unenrolled voters, independents, can take a Republican ballot in the primary. They happen to be concentrated in the early part of the voting. New Hampshire is not the only state in the country. I would expect to make a good showing in the left coast, so to speak, California, Oregon, Washington.
Right. So the Weld strategy here is you do well in New Hampshire, and then you get the momentum, and where's next?
Well, it's true. If you do well in New Hampshire, you do get momentum. But I certainly am not a stranger in any of the 6 New England states, nor in California, nor in the Mid-Atlantic states, I'd go to those places, the Intermountain West, which I got to know in the last campaign quite a lot, and then the toughest nuts would be the Rust Belt, and I do give the president political credit for having seen that his only path to victory lay through the Rust Belt. He said that as early as April of the election year. No one took it seriously because they didn't think he had a shot. But the tide has turned against the Republicans in those states, so who knows how solid they are now. But I'm talking about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan.
Let me ask a couple of policy questions, one domestic, the other foreign. Healthcare has dominated our politics for a couple of decades now, and including this last midterm election. What would you repeal Obamacare, or do you support Obamacare?
Well, how about neither of the above? Is that okay? I do think we're
Medicare for all.
No.
Okay.
We're really wasting a lot of time in Washington by spending so much time in Congress on let's repeal it, let's reaffirm it. We do not have a consensus in Congress about the Affordable Care Act. So, I don't see that there's a lot of blood that should be shed over that right now. There are things that can be done. Prescription drugs are entirely too expensive now, so let people buy them across state lines and buy them in other countries abroad. If they want to buy them from Canada, let them buy them from Canada. Don't tell them we're the nanny state. We're going to tell you that Canada's drugs are no damn good if people do want to buy them. Let people have health savings accounts. I mean, I'm in favor across the board, not just healthcare, of putting as much power as possible in the hands of the individual. So let individuals have health savings accounts, and they can sock away money to provide for the kind of healthcare that they want. They may not want the Cadillac that the Affordable Care Act gives them. And the one demerit of the Affordable Care Act is it virtually insists that everyone's got to have the Cadillac. Well, maybe a lot of people would rather have a Chevrolet, and that should be up to them. And it's nanny statism to tell people they can't have the Chevrolet. I feel a little bit the same way about Social Security. Let people have individual retirement accounts so they can salt away money against their golden years to the extent they want to do so.
So people hearing you say that will say Weld wants to abolish Social Security.
No, I want, in addition to Social Security, have people be able to put away in a tax-advantaged manner funds against their retirement. Right now, it's the government's got to do it. And, the government's got to do it never sounds good to me.
By the way, and then I want to get to the foreign policy question, but do you think, as Donald Trump said at the CPAC conference, and a lot of Republicans have been saying, that the Democratic Party is moving towards socialism?
Well, some of the recent proposals are avowedly socialistic. I don't think that's a good thing. I hope the Dems can come up with centrist candidates for the 2020 election.
Maintaining your libertarian roots, I noted that you have joined the advisory board of a company, Acreage Holdings, which cultivates, processes, and dispenses cannabis in 11 states.
I've thought that since 1991. I said in 1991, my first year in office, hey, they say that, marijuana is good for glaucoma and nausea from chemotherapy. Why not let people use it for those two things?
Right. Well, that's medical. What about full-scale legalization?
I think it should be a states' rights issue, state by state. Things have changed since 1991. I was way out there by myself on that and on gay and lesbian rights and that sort of thing, and nobody else was around for 15 years or so. But
so
now the American people, state by state, blue states and red states have decided, and I think the figure is something like 94% are in favor of medicinal marijuana and 64% in favor of full adult legal.
So you'd be in favor of allowing states to pass laws allowing
they are
recreational.
Laws.
Yeah, but the federal government,
there's still
as
a
a
federal
former
law,
right?
Okay,
this Justice Department says it's going to prosecute
that's
those
what
cases.
That's
right?
what Barr said. But do you?
No, he said he's not going to prosecute if it's legal in that state. He did not have AG Barr does not have the same position that AG Sessions.
But
has.
would President Weld push for repeal of the federal law?
Day one.
Day one.
Descheduling? Absolutely.
Descheduling, full-scale legalization.
No, that's not the
What's
same
the
thing.
difference?
It takes it off the schedule
DEA
of
list.
DEA and National Institute of Drug Abuse.
But if a
list.
state wants to pass recreational drug, marijuana, right? But that's fine with you.
But wait, what's the
that's
difference
fine.
between full-scale legalization and what you're saying?
The sword in the bed is the fact that cannabis is listed by the FDA as a Schedule I narcotic, which means it has absolutely no medicinal value, which is a complete lie. The FDA has even licensed an anti-childhood epilepsy drug it's called Epidiolex, and they said this is good, and their excuse for doing it in the face of Schedule I is, they're manufactured in Great Britain. Yeah. More recently, it's been illegal to study marijuana or cannabis in this country.
I get that, but
okay. So recently, the federal government has said, well, actually, you can study in California, you can do this, but you got to import the marijuana from Canada. Right. I mean, what? Those two things show the hypocrisy of the technical position of the federal government. And candidate Trump in 2016, I think this story may have a happy ending because there's a lot of oomph behind the States Act that Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts are behind. And the House is all for that, and that's off to a good start in the Senate. And, most observers of the industry think that will become law by the third quarter of this year. End of problem.
Just to be clear, you want to get rid of the scheduling of marijuana as a dangerous drug.
Right.
But How is that different than just lifting all restrictions on smoking or partaking in marijuana?
You can't
completely?
have
legalization, full-scale legalization.
You can't have full legalization as long as that Schedule 1 is there.
Right,
It's
but you remove
inconsistent.
that. And,
So you remove that, and my position is not let's have full-scale federal legalization. It's let's let the states do what they want. If Alabama wants to never have adult legal rec, and I suspect that might be the case, we shouldn't be telling them that they should do so. And that's the position that Donald Trump took during the campaign, and I agree with it. And so does my colleague on that board, John Boehner, who used to be implacably opposed to the legalization.
We're going to wrap up in a second, but I did have one foreign policy question for you, which is we still have many thousands of Americans in harm's way, including more than 10,000 American troops in Afghanistan. What would you do about Afghanistan? Would you pull out the troops?
I would. I think the president got it right the first time. You know, we've been there a long time. What is it, 17, 18 years? And I've heard from intelligence folks the story of when we were first going into Afghanistan, the president had a senior CIA person call up his Russian counterpart and say, we're thinking of going to Afghanistan. We don't want to start World War III over this because we know it's right on your border. So tell us how upset you would be. The guy died laughing. The Russian guy just died laughing. He said, I want to encourage you to go in there with as big a force as you can and enjoy all the success that the British enjoyed in Afghanistan and that the Soviet Union enjoyed in Afghanistan, and have a nice day.
Right.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
Governor Bill Weld, thanks for joining us on Skullduggery, and good luck, and be happy on the campaign trail.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mike. Always a pleasure.
Thanks to presidential hopeful Bill Weld for joining us on this episode of Skullduggery. Don't forget to subscribe to Skullduggery on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And tell us what you think. Leave a review. The latest episode is also on SiriusXM on the weekend. Check it out on POTUS Channel 124 on Saturdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, with replays on Sundays at 1 a.m. and 3 p.m. Be sure to follow us on social media at Skullduggery Pod. And now you can watch the podcast on yahoonews.com, YouTube, and Roku Saturdays and Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Talk to you soon.